More than 23,000 women in Italy were violated during what the world remembers as a campaign of liberation. The year was 1943, and Allied soldiers hailed as heroes stormed the beaches of Sicily shouting death to fascism. But behind the thunder of artillery and the waving flags, another war began. A war against unarmed civilians, a war that tore apart villages and families. Imagine the horror of mothers dragged before their children. Young girls hiding in the dark only to be found. Fathers cut down, trying to protect their daughters. These were not accidents of war. They were choices. Choices carried out under banners of freedom. And history for decades chose to look away. On July 10, 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Winston Churchill called Italy the soft underbelly of the Axis. 4,000 aircraft, 285 warships, and nearly 3,000 transport vessels carried soldiers to Italian soil. This was the opening of the Italian campaign, the gateway to Europe. Yet alongside military triumph came tragedy. Units of Moroccan Goumiers brought in under French command unleashed terror. Civilians were robbed, beaten, and violated. In towns like Gela, Capizzi, and Lacio, the so-called liberators committed crimes so severe that survivors would whisper about them for decades, calling it the Moroccan Eight. This story is not the one told in schoolbooks. It is a darker truth hidden beneath the celebration of victory. The summer of 1943 was heavy with anticipation. After years of brutal fighting in North Africa, the Allies turned their eyes toward Europe. The chosen entry point was Italy, a land Winston Churchill once described as the soft underbelly of the Axis. From this invasion, they hoped to topple Mussolini, secure the Mediterranean, and prepare the road toward Normandy. On the morning of July 10th, the largest amphibious operation up to that point began. More than 4,000 combat and transport aircraft filled the skies. 285 warships and 2 aircraft carriers guarded the convoys. 2,775 transport units carried tens of thousands of soldiers across the waves. They came ashore between Licata and Syracuse, launching the Italian campaign with thunderous force. To many Italians, the sight of Allied forces raised both fear and fragile hope. Some believed liberation had come. Yet within hours, the reality proved far darker. General George S. Patton, leading American forces, had requested Moroccan units to represent the French army. French General Jan answered by sending the 4th Tab, commanded by Captain Verret. These Moroccan Goumiers carried not only Allied rifles, but also curved daggers called Cumia. They soon became infamous for severing the ears of the fallen, stringing them into necklaces like gruesome trophies. In towns along the Sicilian interior, stories spread faster than the soldiers marched. Families hid in barns and caves, desperate to protect their daughters. Farmers whispered warnings. The Moroccans are coming. The fear was not of battles between armies, but of assaults against civilians. In Capizzi, they detained villagers at the gates, stripping men and women of watches, rings, and wallets. A woman's earring was torn from her ear so violently that blood streamed down her neck. The offender was punished by being tied to a horse and dragged, but such punishment changed little. The rampage continued. The massacres began immediately. In Gela, after intense bombardment, Italian garrisons surrendered. 36 Italian soldiers and 4 Germans emerged with hands raised. Instead of being taken prisoner, they were lined up. Captain Compton of the American forces gave a chilling order. Those not killed instantly were finished with pistol shots to the head. Survivors later testified that the men had begged for their lives on their knees, but no American objected. That same week, civilians bore the brunt of indiscriminate violence. In Barrafranca between Enna and Piazza Armerina, 49 civilians were cut down by low-flying American aircraft. Among them were 15 children. In Piano Stella, a young peasant woman was assaulted while her neighbors were gunned down. In Ragusa, 110 Italian prisoners were massacred on July 18th. For villagers, There was no clear line between liberation and occupation. On one hand, the Allied presence pushed out the fascists. On the other, their homes became battlefields, their families victims of an army meant to free them. Italians tried to balance between welcoming soldiers who promised freedom and hiding from the same soldiers who took everything from them. The British command distributed pamphlets titled Sicily's Own Handbook. The text portrayed Sicilians as people accustomed to subjugation and exploitation. It warned soldiers to distrust the locals. The very language encouraged superiority and suspicion, planting seeds for mistreatment. Even the code word for Allied paratroopers, "kill the Italians," foreshadowed what would follow. In the city of Lazio, the people endured unspeakable violence. Between May 2nd and May 5th of 1944, Moroccan divisions stormed homes with weapons drawn. Families were forced to watch as their wives, daughters, and mothers were violated. Husbands who resisted were beaten or killed. Children stood frozen as their mothers screamed for mercy. Official reports recorded 626 verified cases of rape in June alone, but the true number was far higher. Shame silenced many victims, leaving their pain buried in silence. Survivors named it the Moroccan Eight. The Moroccan Eight, a wound that scarred generations. The destruction did not stop at bodies. It reached stone and soil. In Castelnuovo al Vuro, Allied officers ordered civilians to evacuate under the pretext of sanitation. Families were herded onto trucks left in neighboring towns with no shelter. Then soldiers dressed as Germans staged a false battle for the cameras. Tanks rolled in, planes bombed, machine guns roared, houses crumbled, churches collapsed. All for a propaganda film designed to show the American public a heroic liberation. When the villagers returned, they found nothing but ruins. Their lives had been sacrificed to Hollywood's lens. Farther south, the sacred stones of Monte Cassino bore witness to devastation. On February 15, 1944, waves of American bombers swept the sky. B-17 Flying Fortresses beat 25 Mitchells, and B-26 Marauders dropped high explosives. The Allies had been warned that no German troops were inside. Still, the Air Force sought to display its power. Civilians fled in terror as the centuries-old abbey crumbled into dust. Survivors later recalled how the holy silence of the mountain was shattered by flames and screams. When the rubble settled, German forces seized the ruins, turning them into strongholds that the Allies themselves had created. The Italian campaign that began with promises of liberation had turned into a campaign of terror. From the massacres of Gela to the atrocities of Lazio, from the ruins of Monte Cassino to the staged destruction of Castelnuovo, the line between freedom and tyranny blurred beyond recognition. The so-called liberators who had come waving banners of justice became for many Italians indistinguishable from the invaders they replaced. This was the high tide of violence, the moment when hopes of salvation collapsed into despair. Ordinary people, farmers and teachers, mothers and children carried scars that history's textbooks would later refuse to print. They were told their suffering was collateral. They were told to be grateful for liberation. But gratitude cannot erase blood, and silence cannot hide shame. When the guns fell silent, the scars remained. For the Italian people, liberation did not feel like freedom. It felt like survival. Yet in the years that followed, their voices were buried beneath the triumphal chorus of victory. History books spoke of strategy, generals, and victories. They did not speak of the women of Lazio, of the children of Barafranca, or of the fathers gunned down in Gela. To forget was to kill them a second time. The silence was not unique to Italy. Across Europe, similar shadows stretched long. In Germany, records first suggested that 11,000 women were violated by American soldiers. Later studies multiplied that figure by 20, hinting that hundreds of thousands had endured in silence. Many were told it was the price of defeat. Many never spoke again. The Red Army left its own trail of blood. In the forests of Katyn, more than 4,000 Polish officers, scholars, lawyers, teachers were executed in 1940. It was not only murder, but an attempt to erase a nation's leadership to break its soul. In East Prussia, as Soviet troops advanced, civilians were trapped by snow and steel. Women and children were violated, elders slaughtered. Berlin itself in the spring of 1945 became a city of despair as waves of soldiers looted, raped, and killed with little restraint. Nor were the Western Allies free of blame. British and Canadian troops committed violations against German civilians. French forces, particularly Moroccan-Gummier, were responsible for hundreds of assaults in towns like Constanza, Freudenstadt, and Bruxelles. The atrocities were not isolated crimes. They were patterns of violence committed under the shadow of flags that claimed to stand for justice. For Italians, the bitterest wound was the comparison whispered in villages that the German occupiers, brutal as they were, had at least limited themselves to taking valuables. The Germans robbed us, some survivors said, but the Allies robbed us of our dignity. This was no praise for fascism. It was a lament that liberation had come at such a terrible cost. Official Italian police reports from June 1944 counted 626 rapes in a single month. Confidential health records spoke of more than 1,100 women in the province of Frosinone and 2,000 in the province of L'Aquila left pregnant or infected after assaults. These were not numbers. They were mothers forced to carry the weight of violation into the future. The global narrative, however, remained one-sided. Film showed smiling soldiers handing out candy to children. Speeches praised the liberation of Europe. The darker truth was edited away, tucked behind closed archives. To challenge the myth was to be labeled ungrateful, even treacherous. And so generations grew up unaware that World War II, the war so often remembered as the Good War, carried with it stories as grim as those of any tyranny. The result was a dual memory. In America and Britain, the war was recalled as a noble crusade, a righteous fight against fascism. In Italy, in Germany, in Poland, many families carried a quieter memory, one not spoken at public ceremonies. It was the memory of loved ones lost not to bombs or bullets on the front lines, but to the crimes of men who wore the uniform of freedom. This was the cruel paradox. The armies hailed as liberators also acted as new oppressors. Their banners spoke of liberty. But for many civilians, liberation meant humiliation, loss, and fear. It was not only the Axis that committed atrocities. The victors, too, carried stains that time, and triumph could not wash away. The story of Italy's liberation is often told in the bright colors of victory. Allied soldiers stormed the beaches, toppled Mussolini, and opened a road to freedom. Yet beneath those banners of triumph lay another story, one of massacres in Gela, atrocities in Lazio, ruins at Monte Cassino, and families destroyed in Castelnuovo. For too long, that story has been left in the shadows. History remembered the tanks and the planes, but it forgot the children killed in low-flying raids. It honored the generals, but ignored the women who carried wounds deeper than any battlefield. It celebrated liberation, but it silenced those who whispered that the liberators had become new oppressors. This silence is a second death, a cruelty of memory. The truth is that World War II was not a simple battle of good against evil. It was a human tragedy that stained every flag. The Allies did fight fascism, and they did bring freedom to Europe. But at the same time, they left behind scars that no monument can erase. To honor the victims is not to dishonor victory. It is to tell history whole. For the American generation that remembers the war and for those who came after, this truth matters. It matters because justice cannot live in half-light. It matters because freedom cannot be built on silence. And it matters because every woman, every child, every man who suffered deserves to be remembered, not hidden. Let's speak plainly. World War II was fought in the name of justice. But justice was not always delivered. It was fought in the name of peace, but peace was not always felt. And it was fought in the name of freedom, but freedom was not shared equally by all.